Okay, so welcome back. This is going to be our very first screencast for Chapter 8. And in Chapter 8, we're going to be looking at the process of photosynthesis. Now, we're going to take this chapter and we're going to break it down into two sections. Section 8.1 is going to focus primarily on energy and how that energy is necessary to life. Now, one question I want you to think about as you make your way through this section is, why do living things need energy to exist? So I want you to keep that in mind as we make our way through 8.1. So looking at the top of our screen, you're going to notice it says all living things require an input of energy to carry out all life processes. Now, those processes could be something as simple as the chemical reactions that occur within our cells, or it could be something as complex as the ability to digest our food. So energy is necessary to make sure that those things happen. Now, the definition for energy is simply the ability to do work. And so if you think about that, as you come into my classroom, obviously you have to sit in your desk. That requires energy. As you take out your materials, that requires energy. As even something as simple as you simply sitting there and focusing and paying attention as I speak, that in itself can require energy. Now, the ultimate source of all energy, of course, is going to be the sun. Now, for some of us, it's kind of hard for us to understand how we would use the sun's energy to do any type of life process. But if you think about it carefully, if you have the sun at the very top, what needs to take in the energy from the sun? That's going to be the plants. And so the plants are going to use that light energy. Now, if you think about the plants, there has to be something there that eats the plants. And if you think about deer, for example, we have lots of deer around this area, they're going to feed off of the plants. So they're going to get their energy from the plants. And if you think about the deer, for those people who like to hunt, us down at the bottom, we might consume the deer. So of course we're going to get energy from the deer. So if you think about it, ultimately our energy did come from the sun. We didn't get it directly, but we got it indirectly. So again, the ultimate source of all energy for all organisms, or I should say most organisms on this planet, is going to be the sun. Now, when discussing the type of energy that is necessary to carry out all the different types of life processes that are required to keep us alive, it's important for us to understand that we are discussing a form of chemical energy. Now, again, there's lots of different forms of energy out there. We could be talking about an electrical form of energy, we could talk about light energy, we could talk about nuclear energy. But when you talk about living organisms, we're referring to chemical energy. Now, the compound that we're going to look at is ATP, and ATP stands for Adenosine Triphosphate. Now, there's three different parts to this molecule. We have the adenine, which is going to be represented right here. We have a 5-carbon sugar called ribose, and you can look at this. It's sort of like a pentagon shape. You have 1 carbon here, 2, 3, 4, 5, so it's pretty easy to recognize. And in this molecule, again, it's going to be triphosphate, so we have 1, 2, 3 phosphates. Now, all the energy that's found inside of this molecule is going to be stored in the phosphate bonds, and these bonds are represented by what you see right here. So now that we understand what the compound is that actually holds on to the energy that cells will need to be able to carry out life processes, I'm going to go ahead and throw another molecule at you that's very similar to the ATP molecule we had looked at before. This is called ADP. Now, I don't want you to get too confused by this, because actually this molecule is really similar to the ATP we had talked about before. Really, the only difference between the two is that the ADP, and the D is going to stand for di, contains only 2 phosphates. If you remember, the ATP molecule, again, T stands for tri, and this is going to contain 3 phosphates. Now, the reason this is important is because if you remember, all of the energy is stored within the bonds that hold the phosphates together. And so when you start off with a molecule like ADP, where you only have 2 phosphates, there's not as much energy in an ADP molecule, and in order to add more energy to it, we have to add another phosphate group. So we're going to change this ADP actually into ATP. So this is considered a fully charged ATP molecule. Now, of course, in order for the cell to be able to use the energy, we have to be able to release it. So to release the energy, we're going to actually go from ATP to ADP. Now, the way that we do this is we simply break the bond. So the bond that's holding these 2 phosphates together is going to be broken. When that phosphate travels off, energy is going to be released, and that energy is going to be made available to the cell to be able to use. So again, the thing you need to recognize here is this. We have basically two forms of this molecule. We have ADP and ATP. Again, this is sort of like a half-charged molecule, not as much energy. This one is going to be considered a fully charged molecule. And the way that we make it fully charged is by adding that additional phosphate group. Because remember, all of the energy is going to be stored within those bonds. Now the way that we release it is making sure that that phosphate leaves. We break those bonds. It releases the energy, and now that energy is available for the cell to use. Now in our previous screen, I had sort of referenced ADP and ATP as being somewhat charged and fully charged. If you notice on this screen and in your textbook, it's going to compare ATP and ADP to a battery. If you think about a battery that's only half charged, that actually represents the ADP molecule. Remember, we only have two phosphates, so there's really only one bond that we're looking at, so not quite as much energy in this molecule. But if you look at ATP, and again, this is going to be triphosphate, we actually have three phosphates and we have two bonds, which means we have more energy in this molecule. So again, the ADP is kind of like a partially charged battery, and the ATP is a fully charged battery. Now again, to release the energy, we have to be able to break this bond. And once we break the bond, the energy is released and the cell can use the energy. Now organisms can use ATP to carry, as we had said, all different types of life processes. Now we had just got finished up with cell transport. Remember, active transport, in other words, the ability to move some molecules across the membrane, had to use energy. Again, sometimes we go from a concentration of low molecules to an area of high concentration of those molecules. So again, active transport requires energy to be able to do this. The energy that it's going to use is going to be the ATP. And the only way that it can happen is by breaking that bond. Again, once you break the bond, then the energy is going to be released and active transport can actually occur. So again, ATP is really good when it comes down to providing energy for different life processes within our body. But the problem with ATP is that it actually only has enough energy for 1 to 3 seconds. So actually it's a quick burst of energy. So it's really horrible when it comes down to storing energy for long periods of time. One glucose molecule can hold about 90 times more energy than ATP. So ATP is good, but glucose is even better. Now you think back to chapter 2 when we talked about the macromolecules. The primary function for carbs, which glucose is a type of carb, is to provide energy for the organism. So it's more efficient for cells to store energy as glucose and only make the ATP when it's absolutely necessary. Now there's 3 different examples below that show how that ATP is going to be used. Now before on the previous slide we had talked about active transport. Remember we had talked about how that particular process requires energy to be able to proceed. So what we're doing is we're taking a particular process where we're going from an area of low concentration and we're moving something to an area of high concentration. And again, using that protein channel. But the only way that you can go from low to high is by using energy. So again, active transport is a good example of using ATP. Now there's also other types of cell structures like flagellum, for example, which help to move the cell from place to place. And a good example of this would be a sperm cell. ATP is necessary to make sure that that flagellum moves back and forth. Another example would be enzymes. Now again, think about this. You have an enzyme substrate complex that needs to form. In order to bring that substrate into the enzyme, you need to have a little bit of energy. And the ATP is going to be available to provide that energy to make sure that we take those substrates and we create the products at the very end. So now that we know a little bit about ATP, what we need to think about here is where do organisms get the energy that they need to actually produce that ATP, so that short burst of energy necessary to carry out life processes? Well, we first need to think about the organisms on this planet as being divided into 2 groups. We have the autotrophs and we have the heterotrophs. The prefix auto means same. And so what that means is that we have organisms here that can actually make their own food. Now they're going to make their own food by using the energy from the sun. So this is a case where photosynthesis is going to be involved. And so we have plants, we have algae, and there's even some bacteria that can photosynthesize. Now the heterotrophs, on the other hand, Hetero means different, means that we have organisms that can obtain food from consuming other living things. So we are considered a type of heterotroph. We cannot go outside and we cannot photosynthesize. We don't have the right parts. So again, hetero means different, which means that we need a different organism to be able to provide us with our energy. So the plant eaters would fall into this category, decomposers would fall into this category, and of course the shark that you see on the right hand side, which is going to be carnivorous, a carnivore, definitely falls into the category of a heterotroph. Alright, so that's going to finish up our first screencast for Chapter 8. Again, do not forget to complete your screencast notes before you come to class.